Well, back when my younger son, Jared, was in kindergarten, his first week, he came home, and Jared likes to share everything. You know, most men, they're very close-vested, but Jared's very verbose, and he's like his dad. He'll just continue to tell you everything and tell you twice. So he comes home, and he says, "Daddy, today we did something called a test, and some kids cried." Maybe, you know, when we went to school, all of us had to endure the hardships of the test. You know, maybe you're one of those fortunate few who enjoy tests and do well on them. Or maybe you're one of those that just endures tests. Some people are known for their ability to do well on tests. And some of us freak out just at the mention of the word test. We experience what's known as test anxiety. Test anxiety. Which actually, we secrete this adrenaline, which actually inhibits our higher functions from processing the data. So it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. But what's the purpose of taking a test? Is it to determine what the teacher knows? No. The teacher or the administrator of the test already knows what's on the test. They wrote it. They're administering the test in order to test the student. But is the test ultimately for the teacher to know what you know? No. It's for you to know what you know and what you don't know. What about God? Does He test His people? Sure He does. Do you think He gives tests so that He can learn something? Certainly not. God knows everything. He's all-knowing. His knowledge is unlimited. Folks, we need to understand that tests from God are for you and me. God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. He has always known all there is to know. His knowledge is unlimited. He does not test us to learn anything about us. He already knows more about you than you know about yourself. So our goal today is to better understand that God is teaching us things about ourselves and Himself through His tests. To better understand what I'm talking about, if you will turn with me to the book of Genesis as we continue our study in Genesis. We'll be in chapter 22 today. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, "Abraham, my father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for Himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood in order and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things, it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah has also borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel, and the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jilpah, and Bethuel." And, sorry, I missed a line there. There 8 Milcah bore Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Remuah, bore Tabah, Gaham, Tashah, and Maacah. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. And it is becoming imminent that I'm going to have surgery on that eye, I think. Praise God. Let's look back at verse 1, if you will, with me, please. Notice that the first thing we see there is, "after these things." Well, after what things? Well, after the things that had just occurred right back there. It refers back to the previous events that we read about a few weeks ago concerning Hagar and Ishmael, and also Abimelech and Abraham, and all of the events that have occurred in Abraham's life before that. But notice that the text tells us right there that this was a test. The text reveals that God is giving Abraham a test. He commands Abraham to take his son, the child of the promise, the son that he waited for 24 years, and take that son and sacrifice him as a burnt offering to God. Now, why do you think he did that? Do you think that Isaac might have meant a lot to Abraham? Maybe some of us have struggled in having children. Maybe it was hard to get pregnant, or maybe there were difficult pregnancies and so forth. Do you think that he might have loved Isaac a lot, his only son? Perhaps some of us can relate to that, having waited a long time. Maybe it was a tough delivery. Maybe we almost lost a child. For any host of reasons, many of us can identify with Abraham and Sarah in holding great value in a child that they waited so long to have. But nevertheless, we don't see any hesitation, if you look at the text there, on the part of Abraham, or Sarah for that matter, when it comes to obeying God's command to slay their only son up on an altar. But Abraham obeys, and notice how he obeys. Look at verse 3 with me. It doesn't say that he rose early in the morning and decided that he was going to pray over this for a couple of weeks. It doesn't say that Abraham went into his prayer closet. It doesn't say that he called the elders of the church together to pray for several weeks to determine whether this was actually God's voice. What does it say? It says, early in the morning he rose immediately and went. Immediately. Why is it important to obey immediately and completely? Well, perhaps you remember there in chapter 17 we talked about this, because you see, friends, delayed obedience is disobedience. Delayed obedience is disobedience. He obeyed immediately and completely. By the way, this sort of thing, this child sacrifice was a normal thing in the culture. The people that surrounded where Abraham was living, that was their culture to do that sort of thing, to demonstrate that their God was even more important to them than their children. And so they would look around and they would say, they probably looked around and said, well, you know, this is what all the other gods are demanding of their parents, and so I guess we need to be obedient as well. But we see here in the text that God is distinguishing himself from the false gods. Whereas the parents went through with their sacrifice in these other instances, God stops Abraham. So Abraham saddles up his donkey and he brings his son along with him with some servants and all of these materials for the sacrifice. Notice that the text does not mention any objection from Sarah. She obeys too. She's obedient. Go back to verse 9. Look at what it says there. When they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Notice earlier that the text said that he left the two men and the donkey that was carrying the wood and laid the wood on top of Isaac and had Isaac carry it. God commands Abraham to take his son, the child of the promise, that he waited 24 years for, to sacrifice him. But here we see they come to the place where God told them. Abraham built an altar there, arranged it on the wood, bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So if we're examining the greater context, we're going to determine here that Isaac is pretty well grown up. If he can carry that wood, that rest of that distance there, and if we look at the greater context, we would determine that he's probably a teenager by this time. Maybe even in his late teens. Now remember, his old man really is an old man. Abraham's about 115, 120 years old by now. All right? So the text says that he lays Isaac on the wood there, so Isaac is obedient too. He could have easily overpowered his dad and said, I'm not doing that. Why don't you go? Right? But no, Isaac goes, Sarah's obedient, Abraham's obedient, even Isaac is obedient. And he passes the test. How about you and me? Have you ever been tested? Have you ever been in circumstances of life where you look back and you say, that was clearly a test from God? We're in the throes of God's work. A major sacrifice comes our way. Are we obedient? Do we ever sacrifice for God? Have we done that? So Abraham is on full ready to plunge the knife into his son. But the angel of the Lord, if you look there, calls out to Abraham. And he says, Abraham, Abraham, and he stops him. Look at verse 12. Go back and look at verse 12 with me, if you will. Where it says, he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Notice that the angel of the Lord says, you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Here's another instance there. We talk from time to time about the Old Testament, and sometimes where you see an angel of the Lord appears, and then other times it says the angel of the Lord, that definite article. And very clearly here, we see that this is God. This is God having that conversation with Abraham. And when you see the angel of the Lord, that's generally either a theophany or this discussion where God appears to a person, and he appears to Abraham and says, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. I want to park on something for a minute here. The statement from God when he says, now I know. Remember how we started out on the text? Remember the text tells us that the Lord tested Abraham. He tested Abraham. Who was being tested? Abraham. Why? So that Abraham can know where he stands with God. There are folks that will look at this text and they will say, well, it says right there, God didn't know. In fact, there's a heresy called open theism. And open theism takes it one step further and says, well, free will of man has to prevail. And so what God has done is he has voluntarily limited himself to the outcome of events. He's limited himself. He knows all of the billions of possibilities, but he doesn't know the real outcome, and he's waiting back to see what man will do, and he's surprised by it. Are you kidding me? Is God limited? No, friends. God is unlimited. God's knowledge is unlimited. God's power is unlimited. God's omnipresence is unlimited. He is everywhere present in space, but in time as well. God exists outside of time. And so the events of past, present, and future are there before God simultaneously. God exists outside of time. He cannot not know things, friends. God does not voluntarily limit himself in this way. It's ridiculous to think that God is limiting himself just so that man's free will would prevail. If that were true, then God's not in control. If that's true, man's in control of the outcome of the events here. I'm sorry, friends, but the Bible would beg to differ with that. God is sovereign. God is sovereignly controlling all things. Make no mistake. The Bible is written so that we can learn more about who God is. And you remember, I keep talking about this progress of revelation. And when he revealed himself in chapter 17 as El Shaddai, that shadow mountain, Shadav, which means great provider. And that's the first time that he's revealed himself in that way. And so as we read this text today, as we look at this, God, as he challenges us to give things up that may be of great value to us, that he may not necessarily ask us to give up, is still sovereignly in control of the outcome of all of these events. And the things that are playing out, friends, are to reveal more about himself to you and I, and for us to understand more about ourselves and where we stand in our relationship with God. Does God test his people? You bet he does. As I was looking at this week, it reminded me of way back in 2006 when we realized that God was calling us away, calling me away from the business world, calling my lovely wife away from being a stay-at-home mom, to move halfway across the country here to Houston, Texas from Vero Beach, Florida, in order for me to go back to school in order to become a pastor. And in 2006, we had our house on the market, and we absolutely needed to get a full price contract for our house. We got a full price contract for our house. It was amazing. The market was in decline. The only caveat was that they wanted us to leave our living room furniture with them, which was really, really difficult because we really loved that living room. But we did it. We left it. But the other caveat, the other proviso, if you will, was that we had to have our stuff out of the house in 30 days. Okay? Stuff's in Vero. We're here in Houston. All of us are here in Houston. By the way, my sons had already started school. We'd already ripped them away from all their friends, ripped them away from their school, and they're already in school, and they're in a school district. So guess what? We got to find a house in the school district. Because we're not going to rip them out of that school after they've been there for 3 or 4 weeks and put them in another school. We've done enough to those poor kids. You know, they're sleeping on a mattress in my sister's game room. We're not going to do it any more to them. So we had 30 days to find a house that my lovely wife liked. All right? So, yeah. So Katy, Texas is, in 2006, friends, Katy, Texas was not the mecca for new homes that it is today. I mean, you can throw a stone in Katy, Texas and find a house on the market right now that's move-in ready. We had to have a house that was move-in ready. We had to find a mover. We had to set up a move. We had to have them go out and look at all of our furniture and everything in the home in Vero, figure out what they're going to charge us, figure out when they were going to bring it, figure out which house they were going to deliver it to, and there were no homes on the market that were move-in ready. Not a one. So, Pastor Doug had a panic attack. Pastor Doug had a panic attack. And I was over in Walmart, and all of a sudden, my vision zeroed down to tunnel vision. I was like, this is not good. This is a very bad thing. So Diane was working, because she's the sole provider now. I'm, going to go back to school, be the stay-home dad. And so I called my brother-in-law. It happened to be a Friday, and he's off every other Friday. He works for Shell. I'm like, I need you to come get me. I don't think I should be driving. So he comes up there, and I get in the car, and next thing I know, I wake up and I'm in a hospital bed. I blacked out. I failed the test. By the way, prior to this panic attack, I had actually found a home that was move-in ready, and it was walking distance to the school. I was like, man, this is awesome. Look, we got a pool right here. The kids and I can walk to school. It's awesome. And he's like, well, I need to see it. I said, well, it's the only one. I need to see it. So we're rounding the corner to the home, and she goes, I hate it. I'm like, you don't understand, sweetie. This is the only home. This is it. So I'm like, can we at least look in it? So walking around here and hate it. Hate that, hate that, hate that. So hence my panic attack. So the next week, I'm telling this story to Jared's teacher, and she's like, have you looked in Falcon Rock? I said, well, where's that? She says, over by the mall. I'm like, well, no, I haven't. So we go over there, and we pull up to this home, and both of us just are like, we're walking around, our dining room will go there, our living room will go there, everything. And we're like, oh my goodness, we're not going to be able to afford this home. Because we needed to pay cash for the home. We needed to net. That's why we needed the full price contract. So we need the full price contract, and we need a house that we can pay cash for. So we go in and we ask the realtor, how much? Because she gives us a price, and we're like, we look at each other, that's $10,000 more than we're going to be able to. So, I mean, this is the only home. I'm getting ready to have another panic attack. And she goes, but this week, we're discounting it $10,000, and we're actually including a refrigerator. To the dollar. To the dollar. It was a test, and I failed it miserably. Miserably. It could have gone any other way. It really could have. But you know what? As someone that was being called to ministry, to vocational ministry, and to be a pastor, what a wonderful, wonderful test and life lesson to say, do you see where you are with me? Where do you think you ought to be before you step here? God is awesome, guys. God is awesome. And he'll bring you to it, man, and he'll bring you through it. May not be the way you thought. May not be the outcome you expected. But God is awesome. So what's our takeaway? I think you know. When God brought Moses up to Mount Sinai to give him the 10 Commandments, he started with the commandments that relate to man and God, and he ended with commandments that relate to man. So, we can draw really this priority of order in the relationship between man and God as being more important. I wonder if we consider that, that we can determine also that the most important of the commands is the first one. You shall have no other gods before me. I wonder if we think about that. If we consider what that really is. You shall have no other gods before me. This commandment is restated in the New Testament. When Jesus is asked what the most important command is, he restates 1 through 4, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then he restates the second 5 in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Relationship with God, relationship with man. The first and second commands have to do with avoiding idolatry. When we think of idolatry, a lot of times we think of, the Israelites. Remember those poor sap Israelites, man, they just kept failing, didn't they? They're there, and 50 days after they saw all those miracles, walking through parted sea and everything, there they are making the golden calf. What we miss a lot of times, though, friends, is that they point to the golden calf and say, there is your God that brought you out of Egypt. They never stopped worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were just worshiping him their way instead of God's way. And when we do that, friends, that's idolatry. That's idolatry. When God says, no other gods before me, he means he's first. And he'll bring us to tests to demonstrate where we stand with that regularly. How are we doing? I mean, let's consider this. How do we spend our time? How do we spend our resources? Where do we spend our money? I mean, if there's ever a time where there is hopefully more money at the end of the month, what do we do with that? You know, or when you have free time, what are we doing with our free time? How do we invest the talents that God has given us? Do we use them for ourselves or to His glory? When was the last time that we felt compelled to make a sacrificial choice? A sacrificial choice with God's purposes in mind. Now, my purposes today are not to make us feel guilty, friends. Oftentimes, you know, we overlay that on the pastor, you know, when I'm just sharing the Word of God. My purpose today, friends, is for us just to take stock of where we are. Because we're all on the journey, and we're at different places on the path. And we're on different paths, friends. So let's check ourselves and see where we are. I mean, there's no shame in failing the test. I sat here and I bore my soul to you. I failed. Miserably failed. And God came through anyway. Anyway, to weak Doug, He did. He did it. All of us as believers have been tested by God. Some of us may be being tested right now. You might be in the throes of a test. We don't recognize that sometimes until it's over, or maybe we didn't. Or maybe we think back now to a situation now that it's been brought to the forefront of our mind and said, that was a test. That was a test, right? But the next time the circumstances of life throw you a curve, ask yourself the question, could this be a test? Could this be a test? Because they're coming. They're coming. You know, I want to end things with this passage over in the book of James. You're familiar with it. It's going to take us to be really, really close to each other before I do a sermon series on the book of James, because it's very convicting. So we'll get there at some point, Lord willing, unless He calls me home first. But in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, look at the way it starts. Count it all joy. Really? Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So here's my challenge this week, friends. Meditate on James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And remember that the tests will come. Look for them, welcome them, embrace them, but look to God for His sustenance in them. Will you do it? Let's pray.